What do you think about the idea that traditional legislating is dead? I mean, never say never, right? We don't know what Congress might do. But do you think that reconciliation is just how this body of government will operate from here on out?
I think all of this is the kind of perversion that is caused by the filibuster. And I think that people are very keen to call for the filibuster to go when Democrats are in charge. But I think actually this is a demonstration of why it should go even when Republicans are in charge. Because what the filibuster does is it says that you can't pass legislation without 60 votes. And in the modern polarized day, you cannot get 60 votes. Barack Obama, I think, was the peak.
And even then, by the way, when the bill, there were corrections that were made to the bill, to the ACA after it was passed, and those had to pass through reconciliation.
Because Ted Kennedy had died.
Yeah, exactly. And then you had Scott Brown, underwear model, coming in.
Exactly. And so they had 59. And so then 59 senators could not pass these tweaks that were needed to the ACA. But what happens then is that you have to move through this reconciliation procedure, which means that the bill has to be mostly budgetary. It's not supposed to increase deficits outside of the 10-year window. And instead what you have is an incentive to cram everything into this bill because you only get one reconciliation bill a fiscal year. And you don't debate the details of it. You don't have separate pieces of legislation. So I think that, Republicans should, if, they won a majority of Congress, they won the White House, they should be able to pass the immigration bill that they want. They should be able to pass the Medicaid bill that they want. They should be able to pass the tax bill that they want. What we instead have is a kind of collapse of deliberation because all of this stuff is sutured into one mega bill that no individual Republican legislator is able to read or understand. And it's then passed. And it's not just the Republicans. The Democrats do this as well. That's what happened with the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, people don't know what's being voted on. The American people don't know. The members of Congress don't know.
There's a problem with how it works at the moment democratically because you can't pass legislation outside this bizarre process. As a voter, it's quite hard to know who to blame for stuff that goes wrong because you elect people, you hand the Republicans, in this case, a majority in both houses, and then they can't pass the legislation they want. And then as a voter, you're cross about that. Who do you take that out on?
I think that's so right because there's a complete breakdown in accountability. If you hire someone to represent you, they go in, and then they're passing legislation that they don't even know that's just so weird. It's worth saying clearly how totally bonkers that is. And I think as a result, you get to some of the compounding effects of declining trust in institutions in American life, but Congress in particular. If you look at those polling, and it's been pretty steady over the years, in which body in government is always the most disdained, and it is very clearly Congress, and I think that's for a reason.
Just to add to that, we've talked so far mainly about the tax provisions and the healthcare provisions, but it is the everything bill. I mean, there's a lot of energy policy in there. There's defense spending. There's immigration enforcement policy. There's, there are attempts to regulate or prevent the regulation of AI. It is everything to do with governing in America crammed into one bill, and then on a straight up or down vote with the president saying, if you vote against this, I'm going to primary you.
Yeah, it's bonkers.
Idrees, let's get to the politics of this. Do you think that the people who voted for Donald Trump will be enthusiastic about the effects of this bill on the U.S. economy?
I think if they knew the details, which a lot of the American public doesn't, I don't know that they would be. I think that the bill we know is fairly regressive because, things like the increase in the state and local tax deduction from $10,000 to $40,000, the increase in the amount of in a state you can leave that's exempt from tax up to, I think, $30 million. That's not benefiting, salt of the earth Americans. That's benefiting the rarefied elite. We see that also with the Medicaid cuts. We haven't talked about the food stamps cuts, but those also will hurt those at the bottom of the income distribution. So all in all, it's a regressive transfer. It also adds trillions to the deficits over the next 10 years, which is ostensibly not what Donald Trump was elected to do. So I think in a lot of ways they wouldn't be happy with it. I don't think that politics kind of hinges on kind of material changes in one's life. I think that they matter more these days about culture. So I don't know that it will change patterns of voting in the same way that the Affordable Care Act showered and the Inflation Reduction Act showered a lot of its benefits on red states in this country, and you didn't really see that much of a shift as a result.
Charlotte, one of the aspects of the bill that we haven't talked about is there's a lot of energy policy in there. Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits ended early, other pieces of lawmaking that will change particularly the deployment of renewable energy in America.
I don't think there's a lens through which you can view Donald Trump's energy provisions that makes sense in any way unless energy is just a culture war issue rather than an economic issue, because the policies in there that have to do with deploying wind energy, solar energy, he wants to phase down those tax credits, those have a disproportionate benefit to Republican states. You know, that's where a lot of that money has gone and would continue to go. So he's interested in, being a petrostate as a cultural issue, and he's interested in bashing the Green New Deal, as he calls it, even though there never was such a thing, as a culture issue. It's not really one that makes economic sense.
Idrees, one of the things you wrote in this week's briefing is that Donald Trump has remade American politics, remade the Republican Party in his image, but on the basis of this piece of legislation and the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, he isn't remaking the economy to quite the same degree.
That's right. I think that the reason for that is that Trump is really not interested in legislating. And because that requires compromise, that requires deliberation, policy, detail, all of the things that Trump has not been interested in. And so in 2017, he turned that over to Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell to basically do whatever they wanted. And he would sell whatever resulted as the greatest bill ever. And he has indeed sold this bill as the greatest bill ever. But it is an extension of the Paul Ryan vision of the world. These lower taxes, Medicaid cuts, food stamps cuts, all of those are very much in line with old school republicanism. And,
I'll just pause you there because Paul Ryan cared more about the deficit than these folks do, didn't he? Or do you think not?
He said he did.
He said he did, but then when he was in power, he didn't. Fair enough.
But the TCJA added $2 trillion to deficits, and the extension of the TCJA, which was very much intended by the fact that the sunsetted this year, will add $4 trillion more.
I think Paul Ryan wasn't transparently a clown. He was a serious wonky person, in contrast to now. But I think the end result, to your point, is he did expand the debt. But
it is all time limited to his term. And maybe the idea is that we repeat the trick and, at the end of this year, at the end of his term, a future Congress, future president feels compelled to extend, for example, the newborn bonus for that long. But really, Trump is enamored with the sweeping use of executive power. That's what he cares about. That's what he likes. Psychologically, he likes being able to impose things immediately, to have people have to pray for relief to him personally, that he has the ability to decide. And that's why he has chosen to run economic policy through executive orders on tariffs, for example, totally circumventing Congress. But the problem with that is that, he has now given up his chance to make a permanent mark on American economics in the way that Bill Clinton did through welfare reform, Obama did through the ACA, the way Lyndon Johnson did through the Great Society, FDR, you can go down the list, or even Reagan. And instead, he's opted for these tariff increases and these cuts to the federal government that are instituted by the pen, which means that they can be very easily swept away by a future president, at which point, what is left of Trump's legacy? It's just the bill, and it's a $4 trillion bill.
I think one thing that's interesting about this bill to me is that it shows Trump's economic populism for what it is, which I think is pretty hollow. The idea that he was going to come in and having heard and, mirrored back to these working class voters who he was able to win in really high shares in the last election, that he understood their pain and he was going to fight with them against the global elite. Instead, he's passed this bill and wants to sell this bill that is regressive, that benefits higher income earners more than low income ones. It actively hurts his own constituencies. So in Florida, his adopted home state, nearly 1 million people would lose their health insurance, according to an estimate by the Kaiser Family Foundation. And I wonder whether you will ever get to a point where members of Congress will see the ways in which just lining up behind Trump is actually politically risky. I mean, we haven't seen that yet, right? They continue to line up behind him. But if you pass policies that damage your constituents, is there any kind of limiting factor here? I don't know.
I still think that actually other factors matter a lot. I mean, if you take a big city Democrat, someone who lives in New York or San Francisco, who is an unabashed liberal, and let's say Joe Biden had imposed some tax that really increased their bill by 20%, 25%, 30%, is that person, and Donald Trump says, I'm going to get rid of that. Does that person vote for Trump? I mean, how high would the bill have to go before you convince that person to vote for the Republican? And I think it works the exact same way in reverse.